In the small town of Riverbrook, where everyone knew everyone, Amina was born on a crisp autumn morning. Her parents, Jin and Priya, welcomed her with overwhelming joy and a home filled with love. From the very beginning, there was something different about Amina. While other babies cried and cooed, she watched the world with wide, thoughtful eyes, taking everything in without making a sound. "She's just a quiet baby," Jin would tell concerned relatives. "Some children are just born that way." As months passed and other children her age began babbling their first words, Amina remained silent. Her parents weren't worried at first. Children develop at their own pace, after all. Priya would speak to her daughter constantly, describing the world around them as they walked through the park or read colorful picture books together. Amina would listen intently, her dark eyes following her mother's every movement. But no words came in return. By her second birthday, when there should have been attempts at mama or dada, there was only silence. The pediatrician suggested they wait a little longer. "Some children are late talkers," he assured them. Jin and Priya held on to this hope. But as Amina's third birthday approached, their concern deepened into worry. They took her to specialists who ran tests, hearing tests, developmental assessments, neurological exams. The results were puzzling. Amina's hearing was perfect. Her intelligence tested above average for her age. There was no physical reason she couldn't speak. Sometimes there are psychological reasons a child might not speak. One doctor suggested gently. "Has there been any trauma?" Jin shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. She's been surrounded by nothing but love since the day she was born." The specialist labeled it selective mutism, though even that didn't quite fit. Most children with selective mutism spoke in some situations, usually at home. Amina spoke nowhere to no one. Not a word, not a whisper. What was most remarkable was that Amina didn't seem frustrated by her silence. Unlike other children with communication difficulties, she never threw tantrums or acted out. Instead, she developed her own ways of making her needs known, pointing, using simple hand gestures, or leading her parents by the hand to what she wanted. At home, Amina created a world of her own. She would spend hours drawing intricate pictures that seemed beyond the ability of a child her age. Trees with individual leaves, people with detailed expressions, birds caught mid-flight. Her parents marveled at her talent and filled her room with art supplies, hoping this might be her path to expression. When Amina turned 5, it was time to think about school. Jin and Priya debated keeping her home longer, worried about how she would manage in a classroom, how other children might treat her. But the specialist advised against isolation. "She needs to be around other children," they said. "Social interaction is crucial for her development." So with heavy hearts and careful preparation, they enrolled Amina in kindergarten at Riverbrook Elementary. They met with her teacher, Ms. Winters, a week before school started. "I've worked with selective mute children before," Ms. Winters assured them, her kind face crinkling with a smile. "We'll create a supportive environment for Amina." The first day of school, Amina stood in the doorway of her classroom, clutching her mother's hand. Her dark hair was neatly braided, her new backpack perfectly positioned on her small shoulders. Other children buzzed around the colorful room, their voices creating a storm of sound. Priya knelt down to her daughter's level. "Remember what we talked about? Ms. Winters knows you don't talk, and that's okay. You can use your notebook to write things down if you need to tell her something." Priya tucked a strand of hair behind Amina's ear. "I'll be back to pick you up before you know it." Amina nodded, her face serious but calm. She squeezed her mother's hand once, then let go, walking into the classroom without looking back. That first day set the pattern for Amina's school life. She was a model student in many ways, attentive, well-behaved, intelligent. Her work was always completed perfectly, but socially she existed on the fringes. The other children tried to include her at first, fascinated by the girl who never spoke. "Does she talk at home?" they would ask her parents during school events. "No," Jin would answer honestly, "but she communicates in her own ways. Children can be both cruel and extraordinarily kind." Some teased Amina, calling her ghost girl because she moved through the hallways so quietly, you could forget she was there. Others appointed themselves her protectors, speaking for her when needed, including her in games that didn't require much talking. By second grade, most of her classmates had accepted Amina's silence as simply part of who she was, like Tommy's red hair or Zoe's glasses. But acceptance didn't mean understanding, and Amina remained largely alone. At home, her parents continued to try everything they could think of. They took her to speech therapists who specialized in selective mutism. They tried alternative approaches: music therapy, art therapy, play therapy. Nothing changed. Amina remained locked in her silence. What her parents couldn't see, what no one could see, was the rich world inside Amina's mind. While she appeared quiet and watchful on the outside, inside she was anything but silent. Her thoughts ran deep and complex, full of observations about the world around her. She noticed things others missed: how Ms. Winter's voice changed when she was tired, how the classroom goldfish swam faster just before feeding time, how the light through the classroom windows created different patterns depending on the time of day. Sometimes Amina would compose whole conversations in her head, imagining what she might say if words could pass her lips. She'd mentally answer questions in class, often knowing the correct response before anyone else. She'd think of jokes that would make her classmates laugh, comforting words for when they were sad. But something she couldn't name or understand, kept these thoughts locked inside. It wasn't fear exactly. It wasn't shyness. It was as if there was a glass wall between her thoughts and her voice, something solid and unmovable that had been there as long as she could remember. By third grade, Amina had developed a system with her teachers. She would write answers to questions on a small whiteboard. For more complex thoughts, she carried a notebook. Her handwriting was neat and precise. Her vocabulary advanced for her age. Her third-grade teacher, Mr. Rivera, was particularly understanding. Amina communicates beautifully through writing, he told her parents during a conference. Her compositions are extraordinary for a child her age. The depth of thought, the emotional maturity, it's remarkable. This was true. When given writing assignments, Amina's work stood out. While other 8-year-olds wrote simple stories about pets or vacations, Amina created complex narratives about feelings and relationships that seemed impossible for someone so young to understand. It was as if, denied verbal expression, all her emotional intelligence had channeled into her written words. Despite these glimpses into her inner world, Amina's silence began to weigh more heavily on her parents as she grew older. They worried about her future. How would she navigate high school, college, a career? Would she ever have close friendships, fall in love, have a family of her own? The questions kept them awake at night. "We're missing something," Priya said one evening as they sat at the kitchen table after Amina had gone to bed. "There has to be a key we haven't found yet." Jin reached across the table to take his wife's hand. "Maybe we need to accept that this is who she is. Maybe our job isn't to fix her, but to help her thrive as herself." Their conversation was interrupted by a sound from upstairs. Not a voice, but a soft thump. Jin went to investigate and found Amina sitting on the floor of her room surrounded by drawings. She had fallen out of bed, apparently while reaching for her sketchbook. Jin helped her back into bed, tucking the covers around her. "What were you drawing that couldn't wait until morning?" he asked gently, not expecting an answer. Amina pointed to her sketchbook. Jin opened it and found a drawing of a piano, rendered in such detail that it seemed almost photographed rather than drawn. The care she had taken with the keys, the pedals, the fine grain of the wood was extraordinary. "It's beautiful," he told her, kissing her forehead. "Now get some sleep." As he turned out her light, Jin didn't realize that this drawing was more than just another of Amina's artistic creations. It was a premonition, a glimpse into a future that would soon begin to unfold. For Amina, lying awake long after her father had gone, the piano in her drawing wasn't just an instrument. It was a door waiting to be opened, a voice waiting to be found. And soon, very soon, that door would open, and the world would discover that Amina's silence had never been emptiness. It had been a symphony waiting to be played. The halls of Riverbrook Elementary bustled with activity as students rushed to their classrooms. It was Monday morning, and the excitement in the air was even more noticeable than usual. Over the weekend, something special had arrived at the school: a piano. Not a brand new one, but a beautiful, well-loved upright piano donated by a local family whose children had grown up and moved away. The piano now sat in the music room, its polished wood gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The principal had announced its arrival during morning assembly, mentioning that music lessons would be expanded now that they had a real piano, instead of just the electronic keyboard they'd been using. Amina, now 9 years old and in 4th grade, had listened to the announcement with unusual intensity. When the principal showed a picture of the piano on the projector screen, Amina's eyes had widened, her small hands tightening in her lap. It was exactly like the one she had drawn in her sketchbook a year ago. "You seem interested in the piano," her teacher, Ms. Lopez, commented as they walked back to their classroom. Amina nodded, her dark eyes serious. The school day proceeded as normal, math in the morning followed by reading groups, then lunch. After lunch came recess, when most children rushed outside to play in the crisp autumn air. Amina usually spent this time in a quiet corner of the playground, drawing in her sketchbook or watching the other children play. But today was different. As the other students pushed through the doors to the playground, Amina slipped away in the opposite direction. She moved through the quiet hallways like a shadow, her footsteps making no sound on the polished floor. She knew where the music room was. Down the east hallway, past the library, third door on the right. The door was unlocked. Amina hesitated for just a moment before pushing it open and stepping inside. The room was empty, the teacher gone for lunch. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, dust motes dancing in the beams of light. And there it was, the piano. In person, it was even more beautiful than in the picture. The wood was a rich, deep brown, with intricate carvings along the front panel. Amina approached it slowly, almost reverently. She ran her fingertips lightly over the wooden case, feeling the smoothness of the polished surface. Then, with a glance toward the door to make sure she was still alone, she lifted the cover that protected the keys. The black and white keys gleamed up at her like a smile. Amina stared at them, her heart beating faster. She had never played a piano before. She had never even touched one. But something about it called to her, as if the piano itself was inviting her to try. Carefully, she slid onto the bench. It was a bit too high for her, so she perched on the edge, her feet barely reaching the pedals below. She lifted her right hand and, after a moment's hesitation, pressed a single key. The note rang out in the empty room, clear and pure. The sound seemed to vibrate not just in the air but inside Amina's chest. She pressed another key, then another. Each note was like a word she had never been able to say, a feeling she had never been able to express. Without really knowing what she was doing, Amina began to play. At first, it was just simple sequences of notes, her fingers finding their way. But then, as if guided by some instinct she didn't understand, her hands began to move more confidently. The random notes became a melody, halting at first, then flowing more smoothly. Amina closed her eyes, letting her fingers find their own way across the keys. The music that emerged wasn't like anything she had heard before. Not the pop songs that played on the radio. Not the classical pieces her father sometimes listened to on Sunday mornings. This was something new, something that came from somewhere deep inside her. She didn't hear the door open. She didn't notice Miss Chen, the school's music teacher, step into the room and then freeze in her tracks. She was lost in the music and the feeling of finally being able to speak. Ms. Chen stood in the doorway, transfixed. She had been teaching music for over 20 years, had worked with hundreds of students, but she had never seen anything like this. A 9-year-old girl who, as far as she knew, had never had a piano lesson in her life, was playing music that sounded as if it had been composed by a master. The piece Amina was playing was complex, emotional, full of subtle shifts in tempo and dynamics. It wasn't perfect. There were occasional wrong notes, moments of hesitation, but the raw talent on display was undeniable. And there was something else, something that made the hairs on Ms. Chen's arms stand up. The music seemed to carry emotions too deep for words. Loneliness, longing, and underneath it all, a quiet, persistent joy. Ms. Chen knew who Amina was, of course. Every teacher at Riverbrook knew about the girl who never spoke. But until this moment, Ms. Chen had never had her in class. The music program was only for 5th and 6th graders, and Amina was still in 4th grade. Slowly, careful not to disturb the moment, Ms. Chen stepped further into the room. She didn't want to startle Amina or make her stop playing, but she needed to see the girl's face to understand what was happening. As Ms. Chen moved around to the side of the piano, she could see Amina clearly. The girl's eyes were closed, her face transformed by an expression of pure concentration and peace. It was as if she had found her way home after being lost for a very long time. The piece came to an end, the final notes hanging in the air like a question. Amina's hands rested lightly on the keys, her eyes still closed. For a moment, the room was completely silent. "That was beautiful," Ms. Chen said softly. Amina's eyes flew open. She jumped slightly, startled by the realization that she wasn't alone. Her cheeks flushed red with embarrassment and she began to slide off the bench, clearly expecting to be in trouble. "No, please don't go," Ms. Chen said quickly, moving to sit on a nearby chair. "You're not in any trouble. I'm Ms. Chen, the music teacher, and you're Amina, right?" Amina nodded cautiously. "Have you ever played the piano before today?" Ms. Chen asked. Amina shook her head. "Really, never?" Ms. Chen couldn't keep the amazement out of her voice. When Amina shook her head again, Ms. Chen leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "Amina, what you were just playing. It was extraordinary, especially for someone who's never touched a piano before. It was as if you were speaking through the music." At these words, something in Amina's face changed. The wariness faded, replaced by a look of such hope and relief that it made Ms. Chen's throat tighten. It was the look of someone who had been understood for the first time. "Would you play something else for me?" Ms. Chen asked gently. Amina hesitated, then nodded. She turned back to the piano, placed her hands on the keys and began to play again. This time the music was different, lighter, more playful, like sunlight dancing on water. Ms. Chen watched in wonder as Amina's small hands moved across the keyboard with growing confidence, creating patterns of sound that seemed impossible for a beginner. When the second piece ended, Ms. Chen knew what she had to do. "Amina, I'd like to talk to your parents. I think you have a very special gift and I'd like to help you develop it. Would that be okay?" Amina's eyes lit up and she nodded enthusiastically. "Good," Ms. Chen smiled. "I'll call them today. But for now, we should probably get you back to your class before recess ends." As they walked back through the quiet hallways, Ms. Chen couldn't stop thinking about what she had witnessed. In her 20 years of teaching, she had seen talented children before, but nothing like this. What Amina had done went beyond talent. It was as if the piano had given her a voice she had never had before. That afternoon, Ms. Chen called Jin and Priya. She tried to explain what she had seen, the extraordinary talent their daughter had displayed, but words seemed inadequate. "I've been teaching music for over 20 years, she told them, "and I've never seen anything like this. It's as if she was born knowing how to play. But she's never even touched a piano before," Priya said, bewildered. "That's what makes it all the more remarkable," Ms. Chen replied. "I'd like to work with her if you're willing. I think with proper training, Amina could become something truly exceptional." Jin and Priya agreed immediately. Anything that might help their daughter express herself, anything that might bring her joy, they would support wholeheartedly. The next day, Amina began her first official piano lesson with Ms. Chen. The music room had been reserved for them during Amina's lunch period. As soon as Amina sat down at the piano, the transformation was visible. The quiet, watchful girl became focused, alive in a way her parents and teachers had never seen before. Ms. Chen started with basics, teaching Amina the names of the notes, proper finger positioning, how to read simple sheet music, but it quickly became clear that Amina's intuitive understanding of music went far beyond these fundamentals. She absorbed new concepts with astonishing speed, and when given the freedom to play on her own, she created music that seemed to come from some deep, untapped well of emotion and understanding. Word spread quickly through the school. Teachers and students alike would pause outside the music room during Amina's practice sessions, drawn by the haunting, beautiful melodies that flowed from her fingers. The girl who had been known as Ghost Girl was now known for something else entirely. She was still silent, still set apart from her peers in many ways, but now there was a bridge between her world and theirs. For Amina, the piano became everything. It was the voice she had never had, the friend she had never found, the way to express all the thoughts and feelings that had been locked inside her for 9 long years. When she played, the wall between her inner world and the outside one seemed to dissolve, allowing her to connect with others in a way she never had before. And as her fingers danced across the keys, creating patterns of sound that spoke more eloquently than words ever could, Amina knew that she had found her true language at last. 6 months after Amina first touched the piano keys, her life had transformed in ways her parents could never have imagined. What began as lunchtime lessons with Ms. Chen quickly expanded. The school principal, amazed by Amina's talent, arranged for her to have access to the music room before and after school. Jin and Priya adjusted their work schedules so one of them could always drive her early and pick her up late. "We need to get her a piano at home," Jin said one evening as they watched Amina practice her finger exercises at the kitchen table, her small hands moving across an imaginary keyboard. Priya nodded. I've been looking online. Even used ones are expensive, but we'll find a way, Jin said firmly. This is too important. They found a second-hand upright piano through a local church. It wasn't fancy. The wood was scratched in places, and some of the ivory on the keys was yellowed with age. But when the delivery men set it up in their living room, Amina circled it with wide, wondering eyes, as if they'd brought her the moon that night. After her parents had gone to bed, Amina crept downstairs in her pajamas. The house was quiet, moonlight streaming through the windows. She sat at her piano, and began to play, her fingers barely touching the keys to keep the sound soft. The music that flowed was gentle, like a lullaby, like a thank you. Upstairs, Jin and Priya lay awake, listening to the delicate notes drifting up through the floorboards. Jin reached for his wife's hand in the darkness. Do you hear that? He whispered. She's talking to us. Ms. Chen recognized that Amina's talent required more than she alone could provide. She reached out to a colleague at the local college, Professor Haruki, who specialized in working with gifted young musicians. I've never seen anything like her, Ms. Chen explained over coffee. She has no formal training, but she plays as if the piano is an extension of herself. Professor Haruki was skeptical. Prodigies are rare, Lena, and children who can play by ear often lack technique. Just meet her, Ms. Chen insisted. That's all I ask. The meeting was arranged for a Saturday morning. Amina sat nervously at the school piano, her legs dangling above the pedals, while Professor Haruki watched with arms crossed. Play something you've been working on with Ms. Chen, he instructed. Amina began a simple Chopin piece Ms. Chen had been teaching her. Her technique was still developing, but there was a sensitivity to her playing that made the familiar piece sound fresh. Now play something of your own, Professor Haruki said when she finished. Amina closed her eyes for a moment, then began to play. The music started softly, hesitantly, like someone testing their footing on uncertain ground. Then it grew, becoming more complex, more confident. It was music that told a story, about loneliness, about silence, about finding a voice in an unexpected place. When she finished, the room was quiet. Professor Haruki's arms were no longer crossed. She needs proper training, he said at last. Twice a week at my studio. We'll need to work on technique, theory, sight reading. Her parents can't afford, Ms. Chen began. I didn't mention payment, Professor Haruki interrupted. Talent like this comes along once in a generation. It would be a crime not to nurture it. And so, at 10 years old, Amina began studying with one of the most respected piano teachers in the region. The lessons were demanding. Professor Haruki was kind but exacting, insisting on perfect technique, proper posture, precise fingering. Sometimes Amina would come home with shoulders slumped, frustrated by her inability to master a particularly difficult piece. But she never gave up. Her determination was as remarkable as her talent. She practiced for hours each day, before school, after school, on weekends. Her parents worried sometimes that she was pushing herself too hard, that the piano was becoming an obsession rather than a joy. Maybe we should limit her practice time, Priya suggested one night after Amina had fallen asleep at the piano. Her cheek pressed against the keys, but when they gently suggested this to Amina, she shook her head vigorously and wrote in her notebook, "The piano is not work, it's how I breathe." They understood then that for their daughter, music wasn't just a hobby or even a passion. It was essential, like air or water. It was how she existed in the world. As Amina progressed through middle school, her reputation grew. She performed at school concerts, local events, even a regional young musicians showcase. Audience members would often approach her parents afterward, amazed by the emotional depth of her playing. It's as if she's speaking through the music, they would say. How does someone so young understand such complex emotions? Jin and Priya would smile, knowing what others did not, that Amina had spent her entire life observing, feeling, thinking in silence. All those unexpressed thoughts and emotions were now finding their way out through her fingertips. At 13, Amina began composing more formally, writing down her musical ideas rather than simply playing them. Professor Haruki helped her learn notation, harmony, counterpoint. Her compositions were unusual, technically complex but emotionally direct. combining classical structures with unexpected harmonies and rhythms. She's developing her own voice, and Professor Haruki told her parents, not just mimicking the composers she studies. That's rare, especially at her age. By 14, Amina had filled notebooks with compositions. Some were short pieces, musical sketches that captured a moment or a feeling. Others were longer works, sonatas, preludes, even the beginnings of a piano concerto. She titled each piece carefully, the names offering tiny glimpses into her thoughts. Morning light through windows, the space between words, what I would say if I could. Home life revolved around Amina's music. The living room had been transformed into a music studio of sorts, with bookshelves filled with sheet music and music theory books, a metronome on top of the piano, a desk where Amina worked on her compositions. Jin had installed soundproofing panels to keep the neighbors happy during Amina's early morning or late-night practice sessions. Despite her growing accomplishments, school remained challenging. As her peers navigated the complicated social world of adolescence, Amina remained on the sidelines. There were still those who found her silence strange, who whispered about her when they thought she couldn't hear. But there were others who were drawn to her, intrigued by her talent and her quiet intensity. May, a girl who played violin in the school orchestra, became something like a friend. She didn't seem bothered by Amina's silence, happily chatting away as they ate lunch together, never expecting responses but seeming to sense when Amina was listening especially closely. Sometimes they played together after school, simple duets at first, then more complex pieces as their skills developed. "You know what's cool about playing with you?" May said one afternoon as they packed up their instruments. "It's like we're having a conversation. Your piano says something, my violin answers. We don't need words." Amina smiled, a rare, unguarded smile that lit up her serious face. At 15, Amina faced a crossroads. Professor Haruki believed she was ready for more advanced training than he could provide. "There's a summer program at the National Conservatory," he told her parents. 3 weeks of intensive study with world-class musicians. "I want to recommend Amina for it." Jin and Priya were hesitant. Amina had never been away from home before. How would she manage in a strange place among strangers without being able to speak? "We're not sure she's ready for that," Priya said carefully. "Have you asked her?" Professor Haruki replied. That evening, they presented the opportunity to Amina, explaining their concerns but promising to support her either way. Amina listened thoughtfully, then went to her notebook and wrote, "I want to go. Music is my voice. They will understand me." The application process was rigorous: recordings, recommendation letters, and finally an in-person audition. Amina worked tirelessly, preparing both classical pieces and her own compositions. When the day of the audition came, she walked onto the stage of the conservatory's recital hall, faced the panel of judges, and played with such passion and precision that the room was completely silent when she finished. 2 weeks later, the acceptance letter arrived. The summer program was transformative. For the first time, Amina was surrounded by people who lived and breathed music as she did. Her silence, which had always set her apart, seemed less important here. What mattered was what happened when she sat at the piano. Her teachers were challenged and intrigued by her. "She has technical skills we can teach, but there's something else there, something innate," the piano master said during a faculty meeting. "When she plays her own compositions, it's like hearing someone's deepest thoughts. I'm not sure we can take credit for teaching that." Amina returned home with new confidence and determination. She had glimpsed a possible future, one where her music could take her to places she had never imagined, where she could connect with others through sound instead of words. As she entered her junior year of high school, her focus intensified. She practiced more diligently than ever, fine-tuning her technique, expanding her repertoire, continuing to compose. Her music began to attract attention beyond the local community. A recording of one of her compositions, submitted by Professor Haruki to a young composers competition, won first prize. A music blogger who attended a community concert where Amina performed wrote about the silent girl with the loudest voice in the room, and the post went viral, bringing requests for interviews that Amina declined. "She's not ready for that kind of attention," Jin explained to disappointed journalists. "Her music speaks for her. That should be enough for now." And it was enough. Because with every piece she played, with every composition she created, Amina was telling her story. She was speaking her truth in the language she had found. the only language she needed. When she played, there was no silence. There was only Amina finally heard. The fall of Amina's senior year began with promise. College application season was underway, and prestigious music conservatories were already showing interest in the silent pianist whose compositions had begun circulating in serious music circles. Ms. Chen and Professor Haruki had worked together to create video recordings of Amina's performances, and these, along with her growing portfolio of compositions, opened doors that once seemed impossible. Eastman is interested, Professor Haruki announced during a lesson in early October. And Juilliard wants you to audition in person. Amina's eyes widened. Even she, focused as she was on the music rather than the acclaim, understood what this meant. These were the most elite music programs in the country. Professor Haruki smiled at her reaction. You've earned this, Amina. Your talent is extraordinary, but it's your dedication that's brought you here. 8 years of relentless work. Amina nodded, a small, serious nod. Then she turned back to the piano and resumed practicing the Bach fugue they'd been working on, her fingers moving with precision across the keys. Professor Haruki watched her, a curious expression on his face. After all these years, he still found himself amazed by her focus, her ability to lose herself completely in the music. At home that evening, Amina shared the news with her parents, writing it in her notebook with uncharacteristically large letters and an exclamation point. Jin and Priya celebrated with her favorite dinner and a small cake. The three of them sat around the kitchen table, discussing logistics for college visits and auditions. We'll make it work, whatever you need, Jin assured her. This is what you've been working toward. What none of them knew, what they couldn't know, was that their carefully constructed world was about to shift on its axis. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Jin was at work, Amina at school. Priya answered the phone to hear Ms. Chen's voice, strained and unfamiliar. I need to tell you something, Ms. Chen said, and I need you to help me figure out how to tell Amina. Ms. Chen had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was poor, months, not years. She had known something was wrong for a while, but had kept it to herself, not wanting to worry her students or colleagues. But now, with treatment about to begin, she couldn't keep it hidden any longer. She needs to hear it from me, Ms. Chen insisted. Can you bring her to my house this evening? Priya agreed, her mind racing. How would Amina handle this news? Ms. Chen wasn't just her first piano teacher. She was the person who had discovered Amina's gift, who had seen her true self when others couldn't. She was, in many ways, Amina's first real connection to the world outside her family. That evening, Priya drove Amina to Ms. Chen's small house near the school. She had told Amina only that Ms. Chen wanted to talk to her about something important. Amina sat in the passenger seat, her expression curious but not worried. Ms. Chen met them at the door. She looked tired, Priya thought, noticing the shadows under her eyes, but her smile for Amina was as warm as ever. Come in, she said. I've made tea. They sat in Ms. Chen's living room, surrounded by books and framed photographs of former students. Ms. Chen's piano dominated one wall, a beautiful grand piano that had been her graduation gift to herself when she completed her master's degree decades ago. Ms. Chen didn't waste time with small talk. She had never been one to avoid difficult truths. Amina, she said gently, I need to tell you something hard. I'm sick, very sick. The doctors have found cancer, and it's the kind that doesn't go away. Amina's face went very still, her dark eyes, always so expressive, filled with questions. I'll be starting treatment next week, Ms. Chen continued. I'll be tired, and I won't be able to teach for a while. Professor Haruki will take over all your lessons until I'm feeling better. Amina reached for her notebook, her hands shaking slightly as she wrote. You will get better, though? Ms. Chen hesitated, then shook her head slowly. I don't think so, not this time. The doctors will try their best, but this kind of cancer is very aggressive. I probably have a few months. Amina stared at her, unmoving. Then, without warning, she stood up and walked to Ms. Chen's piano. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and began to play. The music that flowed from her fingers was unlike anything Ms. Chen or Priya had heard from her before. Raw, angry, full of discord and pain. It was the sound of grief given voice, of rage against the unfairness of life. Ms. Chen listened, tears streaming down her face. When Amina finally stopped playing, the silence in the room was profound. That was beautiful, Ms. Chen said softly. That's exactly how I felt when the doctor told me. Amina turned to look at her, and in that moment something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words could express. Then Amina returned to the piano and began to play again. This time the music was different, still sad but with a gentleness to it, a warmth that spoke of love and gratitude. When they left Ms. Chen's house an hour later, no more words had been spoken or written. None were needed. The music had said everything. The next few weeks were difficult. Amina threw herself into her music with an intensity that worried her parents. She practiced for hours, sometimes until her fingers were so sore she could barely bend them. Her compositions took on a darker quality, complex, brooding pieces full of unresolved tension and haunting melodies. She visited Ms. Chen whenever she could, bringing her notebook full of news about school and her college applications, but mostly playing for her. As Ms. Chen grew weaker from the treatments, these private concerts became their primary form of communication. Amina pouring her heart into the music, Ms. Chen listening with closed eyes, occasionally offering a gentle correction or suggestion. Professor Haruki tried to keep Amina's technical training on track, aware of the approaching college auditions, but he too noticed the change in her playing. The emotion is even more powerful now, he told Jin after a particularly intense lesson. But there's a darkness to it that wasn't there before. She's processing her grief through the music. It's natural, but I worry about her. December brought news that should have been cause for celebration. Amina had been selected as one of 12 finalists for the Young American Composers Award, a prestigious competition that could open even more doors for her future. The finalists would perform their original compositions at a gala concert in New York in April. When Amina shared this news with Ms. Chen, the older woman's face lit up with pride. "You have to play your newest piece," she insisted. "The one you played for me last week. It's your best work yet." But as winter deepened, Ms. Chen's condition worsened. The treatments were taking a toll, leaving her exhausted and in pain. By January, she had been admitted to the hospital. Amina visited every day after school, sometimes bringing her portable keyboard to play softly in the hospital room. The hospital staff bent the rules for these visits, moved by the sight of the silent girl playing for her ailing teacher. "It's better medicine than anything we can give her," one nurse commented. One snowy afternoon in late February, Amina arrived at the hospital to find Ms. Chen sleeping, her breathing shallow and labored. She set up her keyboard anyway and began to play, a gentle lullaby-like piece she had composed that morning. Halfway through, Ms. Chen opened her eyes. "That's lovely," she whispered. "What's it called?" Amina wrote in her notebook. "For Lena." Ms. Chen smiled weakly. "Play it again for me?" Amina played, her eyes fixed on Ms. Chen's face, memorizing every detail. The curve of her cheek, the gray streaks in her hair, the warm brown of her eyes. Somehow she knew this would be the last time. Ms. Chen died that night, peacefully in her sleep. When Jin called to tell Amina the news, she didn't seem surprised. She simply nodded, closed her bedroom door, and didn't come out until morning. The days that followed passed in a blur. There was a memorial service at the school, where former students played pieces Ms. Chen had taught them. Amina was asked to play too, but she shook her head firmly when the principal approached her. For the first time since she had discovered the piano, Amina refused to play. In fact, as March turned to April, Amina stopped playing altogether. The piano in the living room sat untouched, gathering dust. Her composition notebooks remained closed. When Professor Haruki called to remind her of an upcoming lesson, Jin had to tell him she wouldn't be coming. "She needs time," Professor Haruki said, understanding in his voice. "Grief affects us all differently." But as weeks passed and Amina showed no interest in returning to the piano, her parents grew increasingly concerned. The deadline for college decisions was approaching. The Young American Composers Award Gala was just weeks away, and beyond these practical matters, they worried about their daughter's spirit. The light that had burned so brightly in her when she played was dimming. "Should we make her play?" Priya asked one night as they lay in bed, listening to the silence from downstairs where music used to flow. Jin shook his head. "We can't force it. This is something she has to find her way through on her own." April arrived, bringing with it the gentle renewal of spring. Trees budded, flowers pushed through the softening earth, birds returned to build their nests. But inside the house, winter still reigned. Amina went through the motions of her days, school, homework, meals, but the core of her, the part that had come alive at the piano, seemed frozen. The Young American Composers Award organizers called, concerned about her withdrawal from the competition. College admissions officers from Juilliard and Eastman emailed, inquiring about her missed auditions. Jin and Priya fielded these inquiries as best they could, trying to protect Amina while keeping doors open for when, if, she returned to her music. And still, the piano sat untouched, a silent monument to what had been lost. She'll come back to it, Jin said with more confidence than he felt, watching Amina pick at her dinner one evening. When she's ready, the music is still inside her. It hasn't gone anywhere. But as days turned to weeks and spring deepened, they began to wonder if the voice Amina had found through music had been silenced forever by grief, leaving her more profoundly alone than she had ever been before. May arrived with an explosion of colors and scents, but Amina moved through this renewed world as if blind to its beauty. 6 weeks had passed since Ms. Chen's death. 6 weeks of silence deeper than any she had known before. The piano in the living room sat untouched, a shrine to what had been lost. The practical consequences of Amina's withdrawal mounted. Letters arrived from colleges rescinding scholarship offers due to missed auditions. The Young American Composers Award Committee sent a formal notice that she had been disqualified from the competition. Professor Haruki called weekly, his messages growing increasingly concerned. "We need to do something," Priya said one evening, watching Amina push food around her plate at dinner. "She's slipping away from us." Jin nodded, his face lined with worry. "But what? We can't force her to play." An answer came from an unexpected source. The principal of Riverbrook Elementary, where Amina's musical journey had begun, called to ask if she would consider playing at a memorial concert for Ms. Chen. "It's being organized by her former students," the principal explained. "Many of them are professional musicians now. They're coming from all over the country to perform. It would mean so much to have Amina participate." Jin hesitated. "I don't know if she's ready. She hasn't touched the piano since—" "Just ask her," the principal suggested gently. "Let her decide." That evening, Jin and Priya presented the idea to Amina, careful to make it clear that it was entirely her choice. "No one will be upset if you're not ready," Priya assured her. "Everyone understands." Amina sat very still, her eyes fixed on the table. Then slowly she reached for her notebook. Her hand hovered over the page for a long moment before she wrote, "When?" "1 month from now," Jin said. "June 15th, the 1-year anniversary of when Ms. Chen started teaching you." Amina nodded once, a small tight movement, then stood and walked upstairs to her room. The door closed softly behind her. Was that a yes? Priya wondered. Jin shrugged helplessly. "I guess we'll find out." The next morning, Jin and Priya left for work as usual. When they returned that evening, they stopped short in the doorway. The sound of the piano filled the house. Hesitant at first, like a voice rusty from disuse, then growing stronger, more confident. They moved quietly to the living room doorway. Amina sat at the piano, her back straight, her head bent in concentration. The piece she played was unfamiliar, something new, something she was creating as her fingers moved across the keys. Jin and Priya exchanged a glance, hope rising in their eyes. They slipped away without disturbing her, but that night they slept more soundly than they had in weeks. The days that followed established a new routine. Amina went to school, came home, and went straight to the piano. She played for hours, stopping only when exhaustion overtook her. The music she created was different from before, deeper, more complex, shot through with both sorrow and hope. A week after she began playing again, Amina left a note for her parents. "I need staff paper. Lots of it." Jin brought home reams of manuscript paper from a music store in the city. Amina nodded her thanks and disappeared into her room with it. For the next 3 weeks, she divided her time between playing and composing, working with an intensity that both relieved and concerned her parents. "At least she's playing again," Priya said. "But I worry she's pushing herself too hard." "This is how she's grieving," Jin replied. "This is how she's finding her way back." As the date of the memorial concert approached, Amina's focus intensified. She rarely left her piano except for school, meals, and sleep. Sometimes Jin or Priya would wake in the night to hear the soft sound of the piano from below. Amina working through some musical problem that couldn't wait until morning. The day before the concert, Professor Haruki came to the house. It was the first time he had seen Amina since she had stopped her lessons. She met him in the living room, her face solemn but composed. "I've been worried about you," he said simply. Amina nodded, acknowledging his concern. Then she gestured to the piano bench beside her, inviting him to sit. When he did, she began to play. What emerged was unlike anything Professor Haruki had heard before, not just from Amina, but from anyone. It began with a single melodic line, spare and haunting, then gradually built in complexity, adding layers of harmony and counterpoint until it became a full orchestral sound, rich and multidimensional. When she finished, Professor Haruki sat in stunned silence. Finally, he said, "What is this called?" Amina wrote in her notebook, "Symphony of Silence." "Symphony?" he questioned. "This is for orchestra, not solo piano?" She nodded. "But tomorrow is the memorial concert. You're playing this tomorrow?" She nodded again. Professor Haruki looked concerned. "Amina, this is extraordinary work, but it's meant for an orchestra. You can't perform an orchestral piece on a solo piano." Amina's expression didn't change. She wrote, "I have to. For her." The next evening, the auditorium of Riverbrook Elementary School was filled to capacity. Former students of Ms. Chen, now accomplished musicians themselves, had performed pieces ranging from Bach to Bartók. Each had spoken briefly about Ms. Chen's influence on their lives and careers. Now it was Amina's turn. The principal introduced her, explaining to those who didn't know her that she was one of Ms. Chen's most gifted students, though she didn't speak. There was a murmur of interest as Amina walked onto the stage, dressed in a simple black dress, her dark hair pulled back from her face. She sat at the grand piano that had been brought in for the occasion, adjusted the bench and placed her hands on the keys. For a long moment she didn't move, her head bowed as if in prayer or deep concentration. In the front row, Jin and Priya held hands tightly, hoping that the pressure of performance wouldn't overwhelm their daughter, who had been through so much already. When Amina began to play, the hushed auditorium grew even quieter. The opening notes were simple, almost stark, a melody line that seemed to ask a question that had no answer. But as her hands moved across the keyboard, the music began to transform. Somehow, impossibly, she was creating the sound of an entire orchestra with just the piano. Her left hand provided the foundation, the deep resonance of cellos and basses, the rhythmic pulse that drove the piece forward. Her right hand carried the melody, passing it from imagined violins to violas, from flutes to oboes. The middle register filled with harmonies that suggested a full complement of woodwinds and brass. The audience sat transfixed as the symphony unfolded. It was a musical biography telling the story of a life, Ms. Chen's life, but also Amina's, and by extension, the universal human experience of connection and loss. The first movement was playful, exuberant, full of discovery, like a child finding music for the first time. The second grew more structured but no less joyful, suggesting years of learning and mastery. The third turned darker, more questioning as illness entered the story. And the fourth movement began in despair, the music fragmented and discordant, but slowly, note by note, it found its way toward something like acceptance, like healing. As Amina played the final movement, her face reflected every emotion in the music. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her hands never faltered. The melody that emerged from the storm of grief was simpler than what had come before, but somehow more powerful. A theme of resilience, of life continuing even after profound loss. The final notes hung in the air like a question, then resolved into a chord that seemed to contain both sorrow and hope in perfect balance. When the sound finally faded, the auditorium was completely silent. Amina sat motionless at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys. Then, as if released from a spell, the audience erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, many of them crying. The standing ovation continued as Amina finally looked up, her expression one of exhaustion and relief, as if she had carried a heavy burden for a long distance and had finally been able to set it down. In the front row, a woman neither Jin nor Priya recognized was wiping tears from her eyes while scribbling notes on a program. Later, they would learn she was a talent scout from Juilliard, who had come at Professor Haruki's urgent request. As Amina stood to acknowledge the applause, her eyes found her parents in the audience. For the first time in months, she smiled, a small smile tinged with sadness but real nonetheless. In that moment, Jin and Priya knew that while their daughter would never be quite the same after her loss, she had found her way back to herself, back to her music. The applause continued as Amina left the stage. In the wings, the principal waited to escort her back to her seat. "That was beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Miss Chen would have been so proud." Amina nodded, tears still damp on her cheeks. Then she took a deep breath and walked back into the auditorium, where the other musicians waited to congratulate her, where her parents waited to embrace her, where a future she had almost abandoned waited to unfold. 3 months later, Amina began her studies at Juilliard, the youngest composition student in her class. Her Symphony of Silence was performed by the student orchestra in her first semester, to critical acclaim. A recording of that performance found its way to the director of a prestigious international music festival, who commissioned Amina to write a new work for the following year. As her reputation grew, so did interest in her unusual story. Journalists requested interviews, documentary filmmakers proposed projects, fellow musicians wondered about the silent girl whose music spoke so eloquently. Amina declined all interviews but continued to compose and perform, allowing her music to be her voice in the world. She developed a system of gestures and expressions that allowed her to direct rehearsals and communicate with musicians. Those who worked with her closely came to understand that her silence was not a limitation, but simply part of who she was. On rare occasions, someone would ask Amina directly why she didn't speak. When this happened, she would smile gently and gesture toward a piano. Then she would play a piece so personal, so revealing that whoever had asked would understand they had received an answer far more profound than words could provide. Throughout her life, Amina never spoke a single word, but her music, her true voice, reached millions around the world, proving that sometimes the deepest truths can only be expressed in silence.